My name is Vex Kaler, and I gave the order that ended my people's reign. I did not know it then. I stood on the command deck of the Dominion flagship, watching a small blue world spin peacefully below us, and I felt nothing but contempt. 10,000 years my people had ruled the stars. We had broken empires older than this world's oceans. We had watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore, and never once had we lost a war we chose to fight. The humans did not know we were coming. That was the plan. Send a small envoy first, offer them a chance to kneel, and if they refused, remove them quietly before they became a problem. Our scouts had watched them for 3 of their years. They fought each other constantly. They poisoned their own air. They built weapons capable of ending their own species and somehow had not used them all. To my council, this was proof of madness. To me, it was proof of weakness. I was wrong on both counts. The order came from High Command itself. A young species, barely capable of leaving its own solar system, had begun broadcasting signals that reached farther than they should have. Some of our scholars feared what humanity might become if left alone for another century. I did not share that fear. I had seen 1,000 young species. None of them had ever mattered. I chose my nephew, Toran, to lead the first envoy ship. It was meant to be simple. Land, negotiate, and if they resisted, make an example quickly and quietly. I remember his voice before departure, proud and eager, promising to bring me their surrender within a single day. I never heard his voice again. The envoy ship reached orbit exactly on schedule. Then, silence. No distress call, no wreckage, no debris field. The ship simply stopped answering, as though it had been swallowed by the dark itself. Our sensors detected nothing unusual in the atmosphere below, no explosion, no weapon discharge, nothing that could explain the disappearance of a fully crewed vessel and 40 of our finest soldiers. I told myself it was a malfunction, a rare failure in the long-range communication array, nothing more. I ordered a second, smaller strike force to investigate and, if necessary, to finish what the first had started. I did not yet understand that I was not dealing with a primitive species defending its home. I was dealing with something else entirely, something my people had never learned to name. The second fleet was called the Ashfang Talon, 12 ships crewed by warriors, chosen from our most decorated legions. These were soldiers who had conquered worlds far more advanced than this one. They wore armor forged from metal that could withstand a direct strike from a plasma cannon. They had never known defeat. I watched their descent from orbit through a live feed, calm and confident, already composing the report I would send to High Command that evening. The Ashfang Talon broke into the atmosphere in perfect formation, lighting up the night sky over a continent the humans called Europe. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Ground forces deployed. Human resistance appeared minimal, scattered, disorganized. Then the feed changed. I remember the first strange report clearly. A patrol of 20 of our soldiers, armed with weapons capable of leveling a small town, walked into a quiet human town expecting no resistance. Within minutes, the patrol's communication went silent. When a second unit arrived to investigate, they found their comrades gone. Not dead, gone. No bodies, no blood, no trace. Only their weapons, left neatly stacked in the town square, as though someone had wanted us to know they had been taken, not destroyed. I dismissed the report as a translation error from a junior officer. I was certain there would be a logical explanation. There always was. By the second hour, 3 more units had vanished in the same manner. Weapons left behind, soldiers gone, no evidence of any weapon discharge on either side. I ordered the fleet commander to pull back and regroup, to treat the situation with more caution. He refused, insisting his warriors did not retreat from an enemy who had not even shown their face. That decision cost him everything. The final transmission from the Ashfang Talon fleet came just before midnight, local human time. It was not a call for reinforcements. It was not a tactical report. It was a voice, ragged and afraid, a voice I had never heard from one of our soldiers before. He said the humans were not fighting like an enemy trying to win a war. He said they fought like people who had already accepted they might die, and simply did not care, as long as they took as many of us with them as they could. Then the transmission ended. All 12 ships of the Ashfang Talon went dark within the same hour. Not one signal remained, not one survivor reported in, an entire elite fleet, gone, as though it had never existed at all. I sat alone in my quarters that night, staring at the blank screen where Torin's face used to appear during our calls. I told myself this was still explainable. Perhaps the humans had some hidden weapon, some technology we had failed to detect. Perhaps it was a trick of their planet's strange atmosphere, interfering with our systems. I searched for any explanation that did not require me to admit the truth, building quietly in the back of my mind. The council convened within the day. Voices raised in anger and disbelief echoed through the chamber. Some argued we should withdraw entirely, that this small blue world was not worth the cost already paid. Others, myself included, argued the opposite. We had lost soldiers before, in border conflicts and rebellions. This was simply a stronger resistance than expected, nothing more. Surely a species with such limited technology could not defeat trained Dominion forces without some form of trick or ambush. I did not yet understand that humanity's greatest weapon was not hidden in their technology at all. It was something far older and far more dangerous. The Council granted me full command of the next operation. This time, there would be no small envoy, no limited strike force. I would bring the full weight of the Dominion's Third Fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, weapons capable of turning mountains to dust. Whatever the humans were doing, whatever trick they had used against Toran and the Ashfang Talon, it would not survive contact with an invasion of this size. I remember standing before my officers the night before departure, delivering words I believed completely. I told them that no matter how strange the reports from Earth had been, we were still the Dominion. We had never lost a war we chose to fight, and this would not be the first. I told them that whatever waited for us below that blue and green world, it was still only a young species, still only children playing with fire they did not understand. They cheered. I remember their faces, proud and certain, the same expression I had worn myself only days before. I wonder now how many of them are still alive to remember that night, and how many vanished into that same terrible silence that swallowed the Ashfang Talon before them. As our fleet broke orbit and began its descent toward Earth, I allowed myself one final moment of confidence, the last I would ever feel as a commander of the Dominion. I looked down at that small world, its oceans glowing faintly under starlight, its cities scattered like small points of fire across the darkness, and I told myself this would be the last night humanity spent believing it could survive us. I did not yet know that within days I would be the one questioning whether my own people could survive them. Somewhere below us, in a world we had judged too primitive to fear, humans were already preparing, not with fear, not with prayers for mercy. They were preparing the way they always had, throughout every war and disaster their long and brutal history had thrown at them. They were preparing to make us regret ever finding them. The descent began at dawn, local time, over a stretch of land the humans called North America. I watched from the bridge of my flagship as hundreds of our ships broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over quiet fields and sleeping cities below. For a moment, I almost pitied them, a world about to be reminded of its place in the galaxy, unaware that the reminder had already arrived. That pity did not last long. Our forces moved in 3 coordinated waves, exactly as planned. The first wave secured what our scouts identified as major population centers, intending to establish control quickly and demonstrate the futility of resistance. The second wave targeted human military installations, expecting minimal defense given what our earlier scans had shown of their outdated equipment. The third wave, under my direct command, remained in orbit, ready to respond to any developing threat. For the first hour, everything appeared to proceed as expected. Reports came in steadily, confirming secured positions, minimal resistance, and no unusual activity. I remember allowing myself to believe that the failures of the previous missions had simply been unfortunate accidents, isolated incidents that would not repeat themselves against a force of this size. Then the reports began to change. A unit stationed near a human city called Denver reported strange movement in the surrounding hills. Nothing visible on any scanner, only faint sounds picked up by their audio sensors, footsteps moving in patterns too deliberate to be animals, yet too quiet to be detected by any conventional means. The unit commander requested permission to investigate. I granted it, still confident this was nothing more than local wildlife reacting to our presence. Within 20 minutes, that unit stopped responding. I told myself it was an isolated incident, a communication failure caused by the region's terrain. I ordered a nearby squad to reinforce the position and continue the mission. They found the same scene our forces had discovered before: weapons left behind, no bodies, no blood, and no explanation. This time, however, there was something new. Carved into the ground near the abandoned weapons was a single word in our own written language, a language we had never shared with this planet. Enough. I stared at the image sent back from that squad for a long time before I understood what disturbed me most. It was not the missing soldiers. It was the fact that whoever had taken them knew enough about us to write that word correctly, using symbols we had never transmitted to Earth. It meant they had studied us. It meant this had never been the blind panic of a primitive species defending its home. It meant they had been waiting. I ordered a full retreat of ground forces from that region, hoping to regroup and reassess before continuing the invasion. That order came too late for many of my soldiers. Reports began arriving faster than my officers could process them. A squad stationed near a human settlement called Millbrook vanished entirely within minutes of losing contact. A convoy of transport vehicles carrying reinforcements toward the eastern coastline was found abandoned on a quiet stretch of road, engines still running, cargo untouched, but every soldier gone without a trace. In each case, the pattern remained the same: no explosions, no visible combat, no survivors left to explain what had happened. I remember speaking with a young officer named Daniel Cole, one of the few human collaborators our intelligence division had managed to recruit before the invasion began, a disillusioned scientist who believed cooperation with the Dominion might spare his people further suffering. He warned me, in the hours before our fleet arrived, that humanity's history was filled with moments where they had been pushed to the very edge of extinction, and every single time they had refused to disappear quietly. I dismissed his warning as exaggeration, the words of a man trying to appear valuable to his new masters. I understand now that he was trying to save my life. By midday, entire divisions had gone silent across 3 continents. I ordered increased air support, believing our superior technology would finally reveal whatever hidden force was responsible for these disappearances. Our scanners detected nothing: no weapons fire, no unusual energy signatures, no visible enemy combatants anywhere near the locations where our soldiers had vanished. It was as though the humans themselves had become the weapon. I remember standing on the bridge, watching tactical displays that no longer made any sense. Red markers representing lost units spreading across the map like a slow and steady infection. My officers looked to me for answers I did not have. I gave orders I no longer believed in, hoping that somewhere in the chaos, a clear picture would emerge that I could finally understand and control. It was during this hour that I first witnessed direct combat footage from a surviving drone unit, hovering above a small human town under assault from our forces. What I saw would remain with me for the rest of my life. Human soldiers, far fewer in number than our own, moved through the streets with a discipline I had not expected from a species we considered primitive. They did not fight in open formation the way our doctrine demanded. They used the town itself as a weapon, drawing our forces into narrow streets and collapsed buildings where our numbers meant nothing. They struck quickly, retreated into shadows, and vanished before our soldiers could properly respond. One moment left the deepest impression on me. A young woman, no older than the human equivalent of their mid-20s, stood alone in the center of a burning street as 3 of our soldiers approached. She was unarmed, or so it appeared, her hands raised as though surrendering. Our soldiers, following protocol, lowered their weapons to accept her surrender. She did not surrender. Within seconds, all 3 soldiers were disabled. Their armor breached through weaknesses she seemed to know exactly where to find, as though she had studied our equipment in detail long before we ever arrived. She disappeared into the smoke before backup could arrive, leaving behind nothing but silence and the wreckage of 3 of our finest warriors. I later learned her name from intercepted human communications. Grace Whitfield, a former engineer who had spent years studying alien technology, recovered from the very envoy ship that had vanished during our first contact attempt. Torrin's ship, my nephew's ship. The humans had not simply destroyed our first envoy. They had studied it, learned from it, and used what they learned to prepare for exactly this moment. I began to understand, slowly and painfully, that we had never been fighting a primitive species reacting in fear. We had been fighting a species already at war with itself, for its entire existence, one that had simply redirected all of that hard-earned experience toward us the moment we arrived. By evening, local time, our casualty reports had become impossible to ignore. Nearly a third of our ground forces had vanished or been disabled entirely. My senior officers began requesting permission to withdraw remaining units and reconsider our strategy. I refused, still believing that our superior firepower and numbers would eventually overwhelm whatever resistance humanity could offer. I ordered a direct assault on one of humanity's largest remaining military strongholds, hoping a decisive victory there would break their resolve and force a surrender. I led that assault myself, determined to prove that the failures of the day had been due to poor tactics among my subordinates, not any true weakness in our forces. I remember the moment clearly, stepping off the transport vessel onto human soil for the first time, surrounded by some of our most capable remaining warriors. The stronghold appeared quiet, almost abandoned, as though the humans had already retreated in fear of our approach. It was a trap, and I walked into it without hesitation. The first explosion came from beneath our own feet, not from any weapon we could detect on our sensors, but from something buried deep in the ground long before our arrival, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Soldiers around me fell as coordinated strikes emerged from every direction at once, human forces appearing and disappearing with a speed and precision that left our advanced sensors useless. I survived only because a young soldier named Nathan Pierce, one of the last surviving members of my personal guard, pulled me back into the transport vessel moments before the stronghold's defenses fully activated. I watched through the closing doors as the remainder of my assault force was overwhelmed, not by superior weapons, but by superior will, by soldiers who fought as though losing was simply not an option they were willing to consider. We retreated back into orbit that night, having lost more than half of our ground forces in a single day. I stood alone on the bridge of my flagship, staring down at that small blue world, and for the first time in my long life, I felt something I had never truly experienced before. Fear. Not fear of losing a battle. Not fear of losing soldiers, though that loss weighed heavily on me. It was a deeper fear, the fear of facing an enemy I did not understand, one that seemed to grow stronger the more we pushed against it, as though resistance itself was the very fuel that gave humanity its strength. I sent my report back to High Command that night, describing losses far greater than anticipated, and requesting reinforcements before continuing the invasion. The response I received was swift, and it carried none of the confidence I had felt only days before. High Command was preparing to send everything we had left. 3 days passed before the full might of the Dominion arrived above Earth. I had spent those days pulling together every surviving unit, studying every scrap of footage we had recovered, trying desperately to understand the pattern behind humanity's resistance before committing everything we had left. I found no pattern, only determination, endless and unyielding, spreading across every corner of that small world like a fire that refused to be smothered. 800 ships arrived in Earth's orbit that morning, more than the Dominion had ever committed to a single campaign in living memory. Among them were our finest remaining legions, Soldiers who had spent their entire lives training for war, commanders who had never once tasted defeat before setting foot on this planet. I stood once again at the head of this fleet, though the confidence I once carried had long since been replaced by something far more careful, far more desperate. I had learned, at great cost, that humanity did not fight the way we expected. This time, I intended to fight the way they did. I ordered our forces to abandon the large, coordinated assaults that had failed so badly during the previous engagement. Instead, we would spread thin, strike quickly, and avoid remaining in any single location long enough for humanity's hidden resistance to organize against us. I believed this shift in strategy would finally give us the advantage we needed. I was wrong again, though in a way I did not expect. Humanity adapted faster than we did. Within hours of our new strategy taking effect, human forces began matching our movements almost perfectly, striking our scattered units with a precision that suggested they had anticipated this change before we had even made it. I later learned the reason. A soldier named Peter Lang, once a quiet analyst working in human military intelligence, had spent years studying not just our recovered technology, but our very way of thinking, our doctrine, our patterns of decision-making, gathered from every scrap of information available since our first envoy's disappearance. They had not simply prepared weapons against us, they had prepared their minds. I watched, through what remained of our surveillance network, as coordinated human resistance grew stronger with each passing hour, rather than weaker. Cities that should have fallen within minutes held out for days. Military installations we believed poorly defended revealed hidden strength at the moment our forces grew overconfident. Every mistake we made was punished immediately, and every strength we relied upon was slowly turned against us. There was a battle near a coastal human city called Brightmoor that I still remember more clearly than any other. I had sent nearly 200 soldiers to secure what our scans suggested was a lightly defended supply route, intending to cut off resources flowing toward the human resistance further inland. It should have been a simple operation. The humans allowed us to believe that, right up until the moment it mattered most. As our forces advanced through the city's outer streets, human defenders emerged not as soldiers in uniform, but as ordinary citizens armed with whatever weapons and tools they had available. A woman named Lucy Hart, who our records later identified as a former teacher with no formal military training, led a group of nearly 30 untrained civilians against one of our most experienced squads, using nothing more than knowledge of the city's layout and an unwillingness to retreat, even as casualties mounted around her. They did not win that battle through superior weapons or training. They won through sheer refusal to stop fighting, absorbing losses that would have broken the will of any other species we had ever encountered, and continuing forward anyway. By the time our surviving soldiers withdrew from Brightmoor, we had lost control of the entire supply route, and humanity had lost something far greater than soldiers. They had lost neighbors, friends, family members, ordinary people who chose to stand and fight rather than flee. And somehow, that loss only made the survivors fight harder. I began to understand, watching report after report of battles like Brightmoor, that we had misjudged humanity in the most fundamental way possible. We assumed a species without a unified government, without a single shared history, without a single shared language, would collapse the moment real pressure was applied. Instead, that same fractured, chaotic nature became their greatest strength. There was no single leader we could remove to end their resistance, no single capital we could destroy to break their spirit. Humanity resisted us, not as one unified force, but as millions of individual decisions, each person choosing again and again not to surrender, no matter the cost. The Dominion had spent 10,000 years conquering species that fought as armies. Humanity fought as individuals who simply refused to stop. By the 5th day of the full invasion, our losses had become catastrophic. Entire legions that had never known defeat in any previous campaign had been reduced to scattered remnants, cut off from supply lines, unable to coordinate effectively against an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. I watched as commanders I had known for centuries, Warriors who had earned their reputation through countless victories across a dozen worlds requested emergency evacuation from positions they had once considered easily secured. I remember one particular transmission that has never left my memory, from a commander named Rask Thaler, one of the most respected warriors in our entire fleet. His voice carried none of the confidence I had known from him during our long years of service together. He described watching human children, no older than the equivalent of 10 or 11 years in our own measurement, throwing themselves into danger to retrieve wounded soldiers from the battlefield, risking everything, not out of any military strategy, but simply because that was what their people did for one another. He asked me, in that final transmission before his position was overrun, how we were supposed to defeat an enemy that valued its own survival less than it valued protecting each other. I did not have an answer for him then. I am not certain I have one now. As the days wore on, I ordered increasingly desperate measures, hoping to turn the tide before our remaining forces were completely destroyed. I authorized the use of our most advanced weaponry, technology capable of leveling entire cities in moments, believing that overwhelming destructive force would finally break humanity's resistance where careful strategy had failed. It did not break them. If anything, it made them more dangerous. A young officer named Ella Marsh, once part of a small human resistance cell operating from the ruins of a destroyed city, led what remained of her people in a counterattack that our forces never saw coming. Using salvaged pieces of our own weaponry recovered from the wreckage we had left behind, she and her surviving companions struck directly at one of our remaining command posts, disabling critical systems and freeing dozens of human prisoners we had captured during earlier engagements. I learned later that many of those prisoners, weakened and injured from their captivity, chose to remain and fight alongside their rescuers rather than retreat to safety. When questioned by surviving members of our intelligence division after the battle, one of those freed prisoners, a soldier named Oliver Grant, gave an answer that our analysts struggled to properly translate into our own language, because the concept itself seemed to have no true equivalent within Dominion culture. He said he stayed because his people did not leave each other behind, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, and that giving up was simply never a choice worth considering. I began to realize, during those final days of the full invasion, that we were not fighting against a military force at all. We were fighting against an idea, one that had been carved into every corner of humanity's long and painful history, an idea that refused to accept defeat as inevitable, no matter how impossible the odds became. The final major engagement of that invasion took place near a large inland region the humans called the Heartland, where our remaining forces attempted one final, desperate assault, hoping to secure a foothold that might allow us to regroup and continue the war on more favorable terms. I led that assault personally, refusing to send others into a battle I was not willing to face myself. What awaited us there was unlike anything I had witnessed during the entire campaign. Humanity had gathered nearly every remaining fighter capable of standing, soldiers and civilians alike, forming a defense line that stretched farther than our sensors could properly measure. They did not wait for us to attack. As our forces descended toward the surface, they struck first, using tactics that combined every lesson learned from every previous battle of the war, coordinated with a precision that suggested months of careful planning compressed into mere days of desperate preparation. I watched as our forces, still numbering in the thousands, were systematically dismantled by an enemy that refused every single opportunity to retreat, choosing instead to advance directly into weapons capable of ending their lives in an instant, simply to protect the ground behind them. There was a moment during that battle I will never forget, watching through the surviving cameras of a nearby drone unit as a small group of human soldiers, led by a woman named Chloe Reed, held a critical position against overwhelming odds, buying time for civilians to evacuate a nearby settlement. Every soldier in that group understood they would not survive the engagement. Their transmissions, recovered later from the wreckage, revealed no fear, no pleading for rescue, only calm, steady determination to hold their position for as long as their bodies would allow. They held that position until every single one of them had fallen, and in doing so, allowed thousands of civilians to escape safely into the surrounding hills. I ordered a full retreat from that battlefield before our remaining forces suffered the same fate. As our surviving ships broke away from the planet's surface, I looked back one final time at that world we had once considered an easy conquest, and I understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that the Dominion had never truly understood what it meant to fight against a species that valued something greater than its own survival. We retreated into orbit with less than a quarter of the forces we had brought only days before. High Command demanded answers I did not know how to give. I had led the finest soldiers our empire had ever produced against a young, fractured species we had once dismissed as primitive, and in return, we had lost more in a single week than in centuries of previous conquest combined. I remember standing alone on the bridge of my flagship that night, staring down at that small, defiant world, and finally understanding the true nature of the enemy we had chosen to awaken. We had not invaded a planet. We had invaded a species that had spent its entire existence refusing to disappear, and in doing so, we had reminded every single human being alive of exactly what they were capable of when given a reason to fight. I stood before the Dominion Council for the first time in decades, not as a celebrated commander returning with news of another conquest, but as a broken officer trying to explain the impossible. The chamber, usually filled with quiet confidence and measured discussion, felt different that day. Every voice carried an edge of fear that none of them would openly admit to feeling. They asked me to explain how a species with such limited technology had managed to destroy nearly 3/4 of our finest remaining forces. I gave them the only honest answer I had. I told them we had not lost because humanity possessed superior weapons or superior numbers. We had lost because we did not understand what we were truly fighting against, and by the time we began to understand, it was already far too late to change course. One of the older council members, a strategist named Vorinth, who had overseen dozens of successful campaigns throughout his long life, asked me directly what made this species so different from every other we had conquered before. I remember taking a long moment before answering, trying to put into words something that still felt difficult to fully explain, even to myself. I told him that every other species we had encountered fought to protect something they valued more than their own individual survival, whether that be their leaders, their beliefs, or their homeland. Humanity fought for all of those reasons as well, but beneath all of it lay something far older and far more dangerous. Humanity fought simply because giving up had never once been proven to work for them, throughout their entire violent and painful history. I spent the following weeks studying every piece of human history our intelligence division had managed to gather before and during the invasion, searching desperately for some explanation that might help us understand how to finally defeat them. What I found instead left me with a far deeper respect and a far deeper fear than I had ever expected to feel toward any species we had encountered. Humanity's history was filled with moments that should have ended them entirely. Diseases that swept across their world, killing more people than any war in their recorded history. Conflicts among themselves that stretched across generations, leaving entire regions in ruins. Natural disasters capable of erasing cities in moments. Each time, by every measure, humanity should have been broken beyond recovery. Each time, they rebuilt. I studied records of a period in their history they called the Great Sickness, when a plague swept across their world and killed nearly a third of the population in certain regions within only a few short years. Rather than collapsing into chaos, survivors rebuilt their societies, developed new systems of medicine, and eventually became stronger and more resilient than before the disaster struck. I studied records of conflicts between their own nations, wars that lasted for years, sometimes decades, causing suffering on a scale that would have shattered the will of any other species we had ever conquered. Yet humanity always emerged from these conflicts, wounded and grieving, but never truly broken, always finding a way to continue forward. It became clear to me The deeper I studied, that humanity had spent its entire existence training for exactly the kind of war we had brought to their doorstep, without ever realizing it. Every disaster, every conflict, every moment of suffering throughout their long history had shaped them into a species uniquely prepared to resist an enemy like the Dominion, an enemy that expected fear and surrender in the face of overwhelming force. The Council, despite everything I reported, remained divided on how to proceed. Some argued we should withdraw entirely, cutting our losses and leaving humanity to its own world before further damage could be done to our remaining forces and our reputation among other species who watched our empire closely. Others, still unwilling to accept the possibility of true defeat after 10,000 years of unbroken conquest, argued for one final, overwhelming strike. I argued strongly against further ground engagement, having witnessed firsthand what happened when we attempted to fight humanity on terms they understood better than we did. Instead, I proposed a different approach, one that avoided direct confrontation entirely: orbital bombardment. If we could not defeat humanity through ground combat, I reasoned, perhaps we could remove the need for combat entirely, striking key population centers from orbit before humanity had any chance to organize their defense. It was a cold, calculated strategy, one that offered no honor and no glory, only cold, distant destruction delivered from a position humanity could not easily counter. The Council approved the plan with surprising speed, desperate for any strategy that promised a quicker resolution to a war that had already cost us more than any conflict in living memory. I led what remained of our fleet back toward Earth's orbit, carrying weapons capable of ending the war within hours, rather than weeks. What we discovered upon our return proved that even this approach would not be as simple as we had hoped. Humanity had learned from every previous engagement, adapting with a speed that continued to defy every expectation we had once held about their capabilities. Using salvage technology recovered from our earlier failed invasions, they had constructed a network of defenses capable of detecting and disrupting our orbital positioning long before we could establish an effective bombardment pattern. I remember watching, with a mixture of horror and grudging respect, as ground-based defense systems, built from equipment we ourselves had once brought to their world, began systematically targeting our remaining ships as we attempted to establish firing positions. A soldier named Adam Vance, once a simple mechanic before the invasion began, had reportedly led the effort to reverse engineer enough of our own technology to build these defenses, working alongside engineers and scientists from every corner of the human world in a rare moment of complete unified cooperation. It seemed, in the face of true extinction, humanity had finally found a way to set aside whatever divisions had once separated them, uniting entirely against the greater threat we represented. Our attempt at orbital bombardment resulted in further devastating losses, as ship after ship was disabled or destroyed by defenses we had never anticipated humanity could construct so quickly. I ordered another retreat, watching helplessly as our once mighty fleet, the pride of the Dominion for 10,000 years, was reduced further with each passing engagement. By this point, barely a tenth of our original invasion force remained operational. High Command, growing increasingly desperate and increasingly aware of how this war might be perceived by other species watching from a distance, began pressuring me for a swift and decisive victory, regardless of the cost required to achieve it. I remember a private conversation with a fellow commander, an old friend named Sarath, who had served alongside me during countless campaigns throughout our long careers. He asked me quietly, away from the ears of the Council, whether I believed we could still win this war. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I asked him a question of my own, one that had haunted me since witnessing the sacrifice made by Chloe Reed and her soldiers during the battle for the Heartland. I asked him what victory would even mean at this point, after the losses we had already suffered, after everything we had witnessed of humanity's refusal to accept defeat, no matter the cost required of them. Sarath had no answer for me either. It was during this period of uncertainty that I began receiving fragmented reports of something new emerging from humanity's resistance, something that suggested this war was far from finished, despite the devastating losses on both sides. Scattered human forces, once fighting independently across different regions of their world, had begun coordinating on a scale we had not previously observed, sharing intelligence, resources, and strategy with an efficiency that suggested true unification for the first time in their fractured history. They were no longer simply defending their world. They were preparing to make certain we would never consider returning. I brought this concerning information before the Council once again, warning them that continued engagement risked losing not just our remaining forces, but potentially opening the door for humanity to eventually strike back at the Dominion itself, should they ever develop the means to travel beyond their own world in significant numbers. The Council, still unwilling to accept true defeat after 10,000 years without a single lost war, made a decision that would ultimately seal the fate of this entire campaign, and perhaps the fate of the Dominion's reputation among every species watching from beyond the stars. They authorized the deployment of the Godslayer Legion. I had heard of this legion only in old stories throughout my long career, warriors so feared and so respected that they had never once been fully deployed in any conflict during my lifetime, held in reserve for a threat so severe it might one day challenge the very survival of the Dominion itself. I had always believed such a threat would never truly emerge. I was wrong about that as well. As preparations began for what High Command believed would be the final, decisive engagement of this long and costly war, I found myself questioning, for the first time in my long life, whether victory was still possible against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every loss we inflicted upon them. I did not yet know that this final gamble would mark not the end of humanity's resistance, but the true beginning of the Dominion's downfall. The Godslayer Legion arrived above Earth 3 weeks after the Council's decision, carried aboard a single massive vessel unlike anything I had ever seen constructed in my lifetime. These warriors were not soldiers in the way I understood the term. They were something closer to living weapons, each one enhanced through processes so ancient and so carefully guarded that even I, a commander of considerable rank, had never been permitted to witness their creation. I was given command of this final operation, though command felt like the wrong word for what I actually possessed. The Godslayer Legion answered to no one but themselves and the ancient oaths that bound them to the Dominion's survival. I was simply present to witness whatever unfolded and to report the outcome back to a council growing increasingly desperate for any form of victory, however costly it might prove to be. I remember standing before their commander, a warrior known only as Kestrel, whose armor bore the scars of conflicts fought long before I was born. He asked me only one question before beginning the final assault. He wanted to know what kind of enemy required the deployment of a force that had remained dormant for centuries. I told him the truth, as plainly as I could manage. I told him this was not an enemy that could be measured by numbers or technology. I told him humanity fought with something far more dangerous than any weapon the Dominion had ever encountered, a refusal to accept defeat that seemed to grow stronger with every loss inflicted upon them. Kestrel listened carefully, then simply nodded, unconvinced that any young species could truly pose a threat to warriors of his caliber. I understood his confidence completely, because it was the same confidence I had carried myself, only weeks before, standing on this very bridge and believing this war would be finished within a single day. The Godslayer Legion descended into Earth's atmosphere under cover of darkness, moving with a speed and precision unlike anything our previous forces had displayed. Unlike the earlier invasions, they did not target population centers or military installations. Instead, they moved directly toward what our intelligence had identified as the primary coordination point for humanity's unified resistance, a location deep within a mountainous region where survivors from across the world had gathered to plan their final defense. For the first several hours, reports suggested overwhelming success. The Godslayer Legion moved through human defenses with terrifying efficiency, breaking through fortifications that had held against our previous forces for weeks. I allowed myself, for the first time since the beginning of this war, to believe that victory might finally be within reach. Then, just as it had every single time before, the silence began. It started with a single unit losing contact during what should have been a routine advance through a narrow mountain pass. I dismissed it initially, believing the interference was simply a result of the region's difficult terrain, much as I had dismissed every early warning sign throughout this long and costly war. I had learned, by this point, to fear that silence more than any battle report of casualties or destruction. Within the hour, 3 more units had gone silent in the same manner, each one simply ceasing to respond without any indication of what had happened to them. Unlike our previous forces, however, the Godslayer Legion did not panic or retreat. They pressed forward with even greater determination, treating each loss as a personal insult rather than a warning to proceed with caution. I watched, through what remained of our surveillance network, as Kestrel himself led a direct assault against the heart of humanity's coordination point, refusing to believe that any force capable of standing against warriors of his legion's caliber could exist on such a young and fractured world. What awaited him there would become the final chapter of the Dominion's costly campaign against Earth. Humanity had spent every day since our previous retreat preparing for exactly this moment, anticipating that the Dominion would eventually deploy its most dangerous remaining forces in one final, desperate attempt at victory. Led by a coalition of survivors from every corner of their fractured world, including many of the very individuals who had already proven themselves against our earlier invasions, humanity had constructed defenses far beyond anything we had previously encountered. Grace Whitfield, the engineer who had once defeated 3 of our soldiers using nothing but knowledge and precision, had spent the previous week studying every piece of recovered Dominion technology available to humanity, searching specifically for weaknesses that might prove effective against enhanced warriors like the Godslayer Legion. Working alongside soldiers like Nathan Pierce, who had switched sides after witnessing the sacrifice made during the assault on the Heartland, and scientists like Adam Vance, they had developed weapons specifically designed to counter the very advantages that made the Godslayer Legion so feared throughout the galaxy. I watched, through fragmented drone footage recovered days later, as Kestrel's forces encountered resistance unlike anything the Dominion had faced in centuries. Human soldiers, supported by civilians who had trained tirelessly in the weeks since our previous retreat, fought with coordinated precision that matched, and in some cases exceeded, the tactical discipline of our most elite warriors. The battle raged for nearly 6 hours, longer than any single engagement throughout the entire war. Unlike previous battles, where humanity relied primarily on unpredictable guerrilla tactics and sheer determination, this confrontation revealed a species that had fully adapted to the nature of this conflict, combining their natural resilience with hard-earned tactical knowledge gathered from every previous encounter with our forces. I remember the final transmission I received from Kestrel himself, delivered in a voice far different from the confident warrior I had spoken with only hours before departure. He described watching soldiers under his command, warriors who had never known defeat throughout their long and storied careers, falling not to superior weapons, but to an enemy that simply refused to stop advancing, no matter how many losses they suffered in return. He told me, in that final message, that he finally understood what I had tried to explain to him before the assault began. He said humanity did not fight like a species trying to survive a war. They fought like a species that had already decided survival meant nothing without the freedom to determine their own future. Then, like every commander before him, his transmission fell silent. I waited, alone on the bridge of my flagship, for any further word from the Godslayer Legion. I waited through the following day, and the day after that, refusing to accept what I already knew deep within myself to be true. The finest warriors the Dominion had ever produced, warriors held in reserve for centuries as our ultimate safeguard against any threat to our survival, had been defeated by a species we had once dismissed as too primitive to even understand the concept of true war. None of them returned. Not a single soldier from the entire Godslayer Legion ever reported back to Dominion forces waiting in orbit. No survivors were recovered. No wreckage was found that could explain their disappearance. They had simply vanished into humanity's resistance, much like every force we had sent before them, swallowed by a determination that our people had never truly learned to understand, let alone defeat. I remained in orbit for 3 more days, uncertain of what to do next, uncertain if any further action could possibly change the outcome of a war we had already lost in every meaningful sense. It was during this period of uncertainty that a single vessel approached our remaining fleet, moving slowly and without any sign of aggression. It was a human ship, small and simple compared to our own advanced vessels, carrying no weapons that our sensors could detect. I ordered our forces to hold position, curious despite everything that had happened, to understand what humanity intended by approaching us so openly after everything we had done to their world. The ship requested permission to dock, a request I granted against the advice of every remaining officer under my command. I met the pilot personally, a woman named Hannah Brooks, who I later learned had lost both her family and her home during the earliest days of our invasion, yet carried herself with a calm and steady presence that unsettled me far more than any battlefield encounter throughout this entire war. She did not carry weapons. She carried something else entirely, an object wrapped carefully in simple cloth, which she placed gently before me without a single word of explanation. When I unwrapped it, I found the torn and burned banner of the Godslayer Legion, the same banner Kestrel had carried with him during the final assault, now returned to us, not as a trophy of war, but as a message. Hannah spoke only a few words before returning to her ship, words that would remain with me for the rest of my long life. She told me that humanity had never wanted this war, but they would never again allow themselves to be treated as a species too weak to defend its own existence. She said her people did not celebrate the losses inflicted upon us, understanding all too well what it meant to lose loved ones in defense of something worth protecting. Then she said something that I have repeated countless times since that day, words that finally forced the Dominion to understand exactly what we had awakened by choosing to invade this small, defiant world. She said we had sent our strongest forces to defeat humanity, and none of them had come back, not because humanity possessed greater strength or greater technology, but because humanity possessed something the Dominion had forgotten centuries ago, a reason worth fighting for beyond simple conquest or expansion. She left without waiting for any response, her small ship departing our fleet as calmly as it had arrived, leaving behind nothing but silence and the weight of everything her words represented. I brought that banner and that message before the Dominion Council upon my return. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Council voted unanimously to withdraw entirely from a conflict we had once believed would end within a single day. We did not withdraw out of mercy, nor out of any newfound respect for humanity's right to determine its own future. We withdrew because we finally understood, at a cost far greater than any war we had ever fought before, that some battles could never truly be won through force alone. Humanity remained largely isolated after our withdrawal, left to rebuild what remained of their world in peace, watched carefully from a distance by an empire that had learned, through devastating loss, never again to underestimate a species defined entirely by its refusal to accept defeat. I retired from active command shortly after that final report, unable to shake the memory of every soldier lost throughout that long and costly campaign, unable to forget the calm certainty in Hannah Brooks's voice as she delivered a message that would echo throughout Dominion history for generations to come. Sometimes, late in the quiet hours when sleep refuses to come, I still think of that message, and of every warrior we sent to a world we once believed we could conquer within a single day. We sent our strongest forces to defeat humanity. None of them ever came back. And somewhere, on that small, defiant blue world, I believe humanity is still waiting, quietly certain, should anyone ever be foolish enough to try again.